Welcome everybody. My name is Kevin Kervick. I'm the organizer of Seacoast Common Sense Community Builders. This is a repeat of our first presentation. It's entitled Classical Liberalism, Modern Progressivism, and the Occupy Wall Street Movement. The presenter is Todd Puterbaugh. Welcome again.
Thanks for having me back, Kevin. First of all, I want to apologize to anyone watching this because I've had a bit of bronchitis or something recently, so I have a cough drop in my mouth, so I apologize for that and for any coughing that may happen. So the title of the talk, Classical Liberalism, Progressivism, Occupy Wall Street. The general theme that I want to address and to discuss is really just has to do with the history of the world we're in and where did it come from. As people who are interested in common sense community building, I think it's important to understand the world that we live in and how you can affect it, and people's attitudes, how they view the world, and to be effective in working with those people, you have to understand where those attitudes came from and how those things came to be. So I'm just kind of go over, at least from my point of view, what some of the history has been for roughly the last 300 years or so, and how the Western world, specifically the United States, has kind of gotten where they are today, and how that affects community building activity that we can do. So the rough timeline I want to go through here is the Enlightenment era, which was roughly the 1700s or so, a little bit before that. The Enlightenment was primarily a philosophical movement, and the real underlying principle to the Enlightenment era was that you could use reason to understand the world. And we all, and again, and this is a theme I'll try and come back to a few times during the talk, is that to most of us sitting here today, that seems obvious. Like, what else would you use to understand the world? There's nothing else you can use to understand the world except reason. Well, before the Enlightenment, that wasn't the case. You had handed down wisdom from books, from elders, from whatever. That things weren't questioned. That if somebody said that's the way it was, that's the way it was, right? And there was no use examining it for yourself. So really, the Enlightenment, the thing that it really brought about was the idea that, first of all, things could be questioned, and second of all, that as you question and study these things, that you use reason to try to find out what the right answer is to the questions. Now, a lot of the real luminaries of the Enlightenment era are the same people who, the next topic is classical liberalism, or liberalism. Some of the same people. Some of the real figureheads of the Enlightenment are people like Adam Smith, Isaac Newton. And back in that time, people didn't really have specialized titles. People now would try to say, well, Adam Smith, he was an economist, and Isaac Newton, he was like a physicist or something. But really then, back in those days, they were all philosophers, right? They weren't specialized, and they were very multidisciplinary type guys. And again, the Enlightenment was really about a philosophy, about a way to view the world, that you can apply reason, that there was an underlying reason to things, and that you can apply logic to understand the world. Now, out of the Enlightenment, and again, some of these are the same people, came a political philosophy called liberalism. And really, the heyday of liberalism was sort of the next 100 years or so, from roughly 1800 to 1900 was really the heyday of liberalism. What people tend to call today classical liberalism, but through this talk I'll just refer to it as liberalism. And liberalism was really a political philosophy. It was a philosophy about what is the proper function of government and what's the proper relationship to people in government. And I'll try and make the point that really today we live in a liberal world, a world that was really shaped by this idea, this classical liberalism, so much to the point that we're not even aware that we're living in this and how different it was beforehand. So what are some of the fundamental tenets of liberalism? First one was that liberty is the primary political value. You know, that people should be able to do what they want, to obtain in their lives what they want to attain in their lives, to achieve what they want to achieve for themselves. That this is the primary purpose behind government or political power, is to allow people to achieve these ends. And again, this was a very radical notion at the time. That was not, you know, for most of humanity beforehand, that was not the primary political value. You know, it was to obey the people in power. It was not to do what you wanted to do with your life. Again, that's related to the next principle, which is, you know, individualism. That you as an individual is important. That you're not, that the collective is not more important than you are. That you have value as an individual. Again, a very different idea from what proceeded through most of history. Classical liberals are also very skeptical of power, or the use of power. Power here meaning forcing someone to do something that they didn't want, that they wouldn't do otherwise. You know, the idea that, you know, I'm going to force somebody to do something that, if you're saying that you should really take a step back and think about whether or not that's a good thing to do or not. And that you should only do that judiciously or not at all. And again, that was a very different idea. You know, before, you know, the idea of might makes right. Hey, if I could push these people around to tell them what to do, then there's no problem with doing that, right? Again, very different from what went before. The rule of law, the idea, first of all, that you have a fixed set of laws, you know, that are regular and written down, and also that everyone is equal under the law, that all the laws apply equally to everyone in society. Again, this was not the norm before the classical liberal period. Spontaneous order, the idea that society can function and get along without having some top-down control, some head man controlling everything, is an idea that sort of comes along new with the classical liberal period. Free markets, the idea that you should be able to go into whatever trade you wanted to do, sell whatever you wanted to sell for whatever price you wanted to sell it, or whatever price you wanted to buy it. Again, this was not the norm. Things, you know, during the Middle Ages, if you know, a serf, you know, if your father was a cobbler, you're going to be a cobbler too, or a blacksmith, or whatever. It's like you did not have this freedom in terms of the market, in terms of labor, goods and services. So the idea that this was a good thing, and this is the way things should be, new with the classical liberalism. Toleration, especially of religious ideas, but just of ideas in general. Again, something that did not happen before. You were burned at the stake for a heretic, you know, before, whereas classical liberal ideas, not the case. You know, that different ideas are tolerated. The idea that peace is a good thing. Again, this is something that I think from our modern ears, it seems sort of obvious, right? That war is bad and peace is good, right? It wasn't the case through most of history. Through most of history, a lot of people thought war was a good thing. You know, it brought out these military virtues and heroism and made people strong, and, you know, that there was good aspects to war. Again, that something that was a real radical departure with classical liberalism. Limited government, the idea that government had some limits to its power, that it couldn't just arbitrarily do anything it wanted to do. Classical liberal idea. And the desirability of civil society, meaning that it's better to do things voluntarily and through cooperation as opposed to force, you know, through militarism or through some sort of government force. So these are the tenets of classical liberalism, and I think when you look at this list of things, I think it really defines the world we live in. It's the way, it's the lenses through which all of us view the world nowadays, I think. And you know, before, I mean, if you look at just slightly before this time period, I mean, it was just crazy. I mean, if you know, they had, you know, laws about like what kind of clothes you could wear. You know, it's like if you weren't a noble, it was against the law to wear silk. You know, or if you met somebody on the street, if they were a different social status than you, there was these elaborate laws even about whether or not you tip your hat or take it off or you bow or whatever. If you didn't do it right, you know, you'd get flogged. You know, there was just all these things that happened beforehand, which I think to our modern sensibilities would just seem barbaric. So during the 1800s was when these classical liberal ideas came into play, and right away in a short period of time, you know, in less than a century, they became the norm, you know, through which everything was seen. So that, you know, by the end of the 1800s, or the end of the 1800s, that this was seen as, all these things were seen as obvious, right? And not only that, there really wasn't too much opposition to these things. I mean, there were some people who were conservatives who wanted the old ways, you know, with the king a little bit, but they were seen as like really backward people, right? And that it was seen by most people that classical liberalism was the way of the future. Not only was it morally right, but, you know, this was the way things were going to be. They couldn't imagine going back to the old ways where, you know, you didn't have toleration of different ideas, where you didn't have free markets, where you couldn't live or work where you wanted to. Towards the end of the 1800s, I think it was really seen as, it was a done deal, you know, as far as the liberals are concerned. It's like we won the fight, you know, that from here on out, the history of humanity is going to be the history of classical liberalism. Well, it turns out that really wasn't the case. I think towards the end of the 1800s, for many different reasons, I think that the classical liberals kind of took their eye off the ball a little bit. I think they became complacent, and they didn't pay a lot of attention to different other political movements that were happening at the time, both from inside and outside the classical liberal school. And one of the things that happened towards the end of the 1800s is the rise of, at least in the United States, of what's called progressivism, or the progressive movement, which really, in a certain sense, had its roots in classical liberalism, where they sort of still had this idea that you know, people should be free to make the most of their lives, but they sort of made this new distinction between negative rights and positive rights, whereas classical liberalism, you know, had this sort of idea of negative rights where you have the right to be left alone, right? Whereas the progressives came up with more this idea of positive rights where you have the right to something. So they, you know, the things the progressives were worried about was, you know, it was the time of rising industrialism, and they saw that, well, there was rich people and poor people, and some people were still living like in this abject poverty, and they were afraid that, well, if you're so ignorant because you're uneducated, and if you're so hungry because you don't have access to good food or healthy food that you can't think straight, then it doesn't really do any good to have, in theory, this right to own property or to be whatever you can be, because, you know, realistically, you're not going to have those opportunities. So they wanted to correct that by having government be active in improving the situation of those people. And I think that was the real break from the classical liberal idea, where they started to get into this idea that, you know, government force was okay if it could be used towards these good ends. And I think that was the real break there. And it turned out that those progressives, they sort of stole the momentum, you know, whereas most of the 1800s was a real triumph of classical liberalism. I mean, you know, pretty much slavery was wiped throughout the world, you know, by the mid-1800s. You know, slavery was gone. You know, an institution that survived thousands of years, it was gone. classical liberalism had brought about all these great advances in science and technology and advances in people's lives. And really, a lot of the modern technology and science we use today actually came about towards the end of the 1800s during the heyday of classical liberalism. You know, things like electricity, modern telecommunications, the gasoline engine, the automobile, the airplane. All those things were invented during this classical liberal time period, or during the heyday of it. And so, during most of that time, everyone viewed the liberals as being the real forward-looking people. You know, they were the people that were looking towards the future. They were going away from the bad things in the past and towards a good future. Whereas when the progressive movement started to come along, they sort of stole the spotlight in that, you know, now, you know, having government do these things is viewed as the forward way of thinking. You know, that if you were some person that's like, no, we shouldn't have the government, you know, handing out money to the poor people. But that was viewed as you were backwards, you were ignorant if you didn't share that viewpoint. So the progressives sort of stole that limelight, I think, from the classical liberals, and the classical liberal ideas themselves sort of died away, and this progressive movement sort of built up where intervention through the government was viewed as the forward way of going, and management of society through the government was viewed as the modern way of doing things. So that kind of takes care of, so the 1700s were roughly the Enlightenment era, the 1800s were roughly the classical liberal era. So what was the 1900s? What really distinguished the 1900s? And when I thought about this, it's like, okay, what made the 20th century different than preceding centuries? And to me, the thing that really stood out in my mind was humans killed each other on just a massive, unprecedented scale that was never done before. You know, World War I, 15 million dead. World War II, 66 million dead. Stalin, 20 million dead. Mao, 40 million dead. Just tens of millions of people dying in relatively short spans of time, just a few years' time. And I think that part of this came from two things. First of all, technology, and again, perversely because of the advances made through classical liberalism and technology, we had the technology to kill each other in these big numbers. But I think that some of these ideas that became popular with progressivism and related ideas like nationalism, where people started to relate themselves to the government, that they were the government, that they said we, meaning the government of their country. Kind of a progressive idea that the government is us and we're doing good things. So if the government goes to war, we're all in this together, we're all going to war. So I think that nationalism led to a lot of this, and just the idea, these collectivist ideas like communism, you know, led to things like Stalin and Mao and all this stuff. Yep.
This is the hardest part of the presentation for me, is because I'm thinking of myself as a patriotic person. Mm-hmm. So it's hard to reconcile this a little bit. So how is nationalism, or how is the rise of nationalism and progressivism connected? How do they go together?
I think they go together in the sense that they both assume that the government is controlled by the people collectively, and that since there is an inherent good in the people collectively, or a desire to do good things, that the government should be active in doing these things, and that the people relate themselves to the government and the government relate themselves to the people. So if the government goes to war, you know, that people feel like it's us collectively going to war. It's not just the people who run the government going to war. Right. You know, whereas before in the past, before you had, you know, these democracies that came along in the 1800s, in the 1900s, you know, a war was something that was done, you know, between the rich guys, the nobles. You know, the common person really wasn't involved in the war. It was generally professional soldiers. You know, sometimes the serfs were conscripted somewhat, like under threat of being thrown off the land, but, you know, they really didn't feel like they had any stake in it, necessarily, other than they were being forced into it sometimes. So they didn't feel like they had a stake in these wars. So it was always just a few people, professional soldiers, whereas now you had this idea of the citizen soldier who was part of the government, and you got more people involved. And there was also the idea of collective guilt, too, right? I mean, people sort of had this idea, well, it was okay to firebomb Dresden and kill a bunch of civilians because they had some sort of collective guilt that by being citizens of Germany, and because the German government was at war against the United States government, killing the German citizens was okay because they must have, because the German citizens were equivalent to the German government. That there was this equivalency between government and the people, in the minds of the government and the people. So I think that's kind of where this progressivism idea of, you know, that you can use the government to good ends, you know, like Woodrow Wilson, you know, bringing democracy to the world in World War I, meaning going around killing a lot of people, was a good end, and that we should all support it. And I think there's a difference between nationalism and patriotism.
What's the difference?
To me, the difference is nationalism is identifying yourself with your government, and patriotism is identifying yourself with your country. Whereas your country is your neighbors, your friends, your relatives, the people you work with, your community, the surrounding communities, your cultural heritage, all the things that make up the country you live in. Whereas not the government itself, not the power elite that run the government, and that's I think sort of a false idea with democracy, is that it's us that are running the government, but in reality it never is. It's always a few well-connected people who are really the ones that are pulling the levers of power.
When I think like a conservative, it's like almost a foreign thing you're saying now. But when I think more like a libertarian, it's, oh yeah, that makes total sense.
Yeah.
Does that make sense to you? It's almost, I think it's a critical distinction you're making.
Because I think the governments effectively are always run by just a few, relatively few people.
Oligarchy.
And so,
Would you say my country, right or wrong, would be more of an example of nationalism versus patriotism?
yeah. Because when they say my country, they actually mean my government, and the government is effectively like a few powerful guys making decisions. And just because these few powerful guys decide that they want to make war against some other people, does that necessarily mean that it's right? Or that you're morally obligated to support it? I would say no.
Thank you.
So, you know, just trying to bring this all back around here. So, you know, I think we do still live in a classical liberal world for the most part. I think even though the progressive movement sort of stole the momentum around the turn of the century, you know, people like Teddy Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson in the United States, where they had this activist government, I still think we share the real core common beliefs of classical liberalism. I think that most Americans, most most of the time, still believe in things like tolerance, that there is some limit to what the government can do, although after today's Supreme Court decision, I don't know.
That's cool.
That we're all in some sense equal, at least have equal rights, not necessarily equal in terms of we should all have the same amount of stuff.
Or opportunity.
But equal opportunity, equal rights. So I still think we do live in a classical liberal world, and that even people who self-identify as progressives now don't agree with us classical liberals or libertarians. I still think there are some core common beliefs. And I think if you look at two of the most recent political movements, especially the two that really involve youth, that there are some similarities there. The two that I'm thinking of is the Ron Paul campaign and the Occupy Wall Street movement. Both of them very youth-centric, that they get a lot of their energy and manpower from, young people. Ron Paul, very libertarian, classical liberal. The Occupy Wall Street people, fairly progressive-leaning or self-identify as progressive. But, in some things, I don't think they're that far off, or they're starting to, or at least I think maybe some of the progressive people are starting to come around to see, well, maybe these classical liberal guys, do have some ideas. So, for instance, this David Graeber of Occupy Wall Street, kind of one of the faces to it. At least he has some sort of academic credentials behind him. He was giving an interview, and he's trying to talk about markets, and you can see that it's starting to dawn on the guy that if you have a market where you have the free exchange between people without coercion, that's actually good, that's actually mutually beneficial, and when you take the violence out of the market, it actually benefits people. And I think that maybe some of these folks are starting to see that some of the classical liberal ideas there's merit to them. So, finish up here to bring this all around in terms of what does this mean in terms of common sense community building. I guess what I would like to say is that even though superficially that maybe there's a lot of fighting between conservatives, libertarian types, progressives, that I think there's enough core shared values that there are things that we can do together and work together as part of a community and to make our community better. And for me, the only criteria that I would have working with other people is that I only want to work with them on projects that don't involve force or coercion on other people. Again, what I think is sort of a classical liberal idea. And I think that works best and actually builds community better. And I think a good example of that is from my town. I live in Barrington, New Hampshire. And this is the parable of the Barrington Recreation Department and the Barrington Youth Association. The Barrington Recreation Department is something that is funded and ran by the town government. And basically, they run the soccer program for the town. They have a little town gym that they sort of run too, and they have some summer programs, summer camp stuff they run for kids. But mainly they have their big league thing is the soccer leagues for the kids. And my kids participated in it. My wife was actually a coach for one of their teams at one time. The Barrington Youth Association is the Little League Baseball Association in town. Now, the Barrington Recreation Department, it doesn't have a big budget, and like I said, they just pretty much run the soccer league in town, but it's the greatest source of controversy in town. That at the town meetings, people line up out the hallways to speak for and against this recreation department. Because it's using force, I think, is what it comes down to. That there are some people that think, oh, the recreation department's spending too much money. Oh, they're not spending enough money. Oh, the person that's running the recreation department, they're just hiring their friends and padding the payroll and this person didn't do anything. Oh, and they hired this contractor to do this work for them, but he's a buddy of theirs, and they gave him more money than he needed, or the work didn't need to be done. And it's just all this constant bickering back and forth, and neighbors up there standing on a microphone at town hall meetings, just trashing their fellow neighbors, and it's just, you know, people calling people names, and it's just really divisive. And it just comes down to the only way the people that are for the rec department or against the rec department, the only way that they can influence things is to go to the town meeting and try to influence people in their votes. That's like the only way, and so that just leads to bickering at town hall meetings, basically. Now, the Barrington Youth Association, they get no money from the town. They own their own ball fields. It's all voluntary. It's all run by volunteers. There's a fee for the kids, but they say if you can't afford it, your kid can still play. They'll cover the cost for you if you don't have the money. And there's never any fights about that. And again, I think it's because it's all voluntary. There's no coercion involved. And I think it's a good example of how, you know, if I wanted to start a little league in my town, if there wasn't one, you know, and if I had a choice, I had two ways to go about it. I could go to my neighbors, knock on their doors and say, hey Kevin, you know, I'm starting a little league, you know, would you like to help me out, you know, either volunteer, maybe give, you know, some money, or, you know, help with you're preparing the grounds or something. And when you do that, you're actually talking to your neighbors. You're actually building community, right? Because you have to talk to them. You have to persuade them. You have to get to know them. You have to see what their priorities are, what they would like done or not done. Whereas with the Barrington Recreation Department approach, no neighbors are talking to each other, really. They're not having an effective conversation. They're shouting at each other, you know, one at a time at a microphone at the town meeting, but they're not actually communicating, I don't think. And I think that's a huge difference. The difference is that when you use government to try to do this community building, you're really not community building, it's anti-community building. Right away you're creating animosity because you're using coercion to try to get somebody to do what you want done, instead of just talking to them and persuading them, which I think is the right way to go.
Could you actually give a couple of examples of what you view to be coercion and the term you used there, force and coercion? Like, I mean, in my life, I've noticed that it can obviously come in many shapes and forms, and you know, the most obvious, of course, is taxation, and then you have laws and things. And if you have, you know, you make a great distinction between positive and negative rights. You know, positive rights, negative rights are those that I have that you can't stop me from doing. I can go do this, but you can't stop me from doing that. Positive rights being those that you have to do on my behalf for me. So I have a positive right to this, you have to go do it for me. So if you could speak to what your opinion is about, you know, what is an okay kind of coercion and force? Because if you set up the environment such that it's in the best interests of those you want to control to do as you want them to do, is that coercion? Is that force? Or is that, you know, that's just free market? So I guess that's really where I'm coming from with the question. What's the distinction? Where do you draw the line?
Well, I think